Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. You know, for all his renown as a writer, producer, and arranger, Brian Wilson had very little success with any of his projects outside the Beach Boys. He did some terrific work for other people, produced some great records, but nothing really caught on, with the exception of his work with Jan and Dean. Now today I'd like to start talking about Jan and Dean. It's way too big a topic to cover in one episode, so we'll make a start, talk primarily about Brian's collaborations writing with Jan Berry, and that'll give us a takeoff point to discuss Jan and Dean in future episodes. Like many other future music and showbiz luminaries, Jan Berry went to University High School in West Los Angeles, along with his future partners Arnie Ginsberg and Dean Torrance. Incidentally, future Beach Boy Bruce Johnston also was going to University High School at this time. While they were still in high school, Dean, Arnie, and Jan were all part of a doo-wop group called the Barons. Apparently Bruce even sat in with them sometimes on vocals and played piano, but was not a member of the Barons. When he finished high school, Jan became the first of this group to have musical success. With Arnie, he formed the duo Jan and Arnie, and in 1958, they produced a number 8 hit single called Jenny Lee. A lot of people tend to think of this Jan and Arnie duo as sort of the Pete Best era of the Beatles, like it was a precursor to what came later. And in some ways it was, but Jan and Arnie were actually quite a big thing in 1958. They were on a couple of the Dick Clark national shows. They even made an appearance in October of 1958 on an episode of the Jack Benny program, where they apparently came out, bantered with Jack a little bit, and then performed their new single, The Beat That Can't Be Beat. I've never seen the show. I've looked for it. I've never even seen photos of the show. I'd love to see what that was like. Anyway, despite their success, by the end of 1958, Arnie Ginsberg had had enough. He didn't like showbiz. He was uncomfortable with it. It was just not his thing. Also, he says that Jan was a bit of a steamroller, which I don't think anybody would argue, so he was a little hard to get along with. So Arnie left. He went on to become a very successful architect, says he'd never regretted leaving for a minute, and that was the end of Jan and Arnie. Now around the same time, Dean Torrance was finishing up a stint with the U.S. Army Reserve at Fort Ord. He returned to LA, reconnected with Jan. Jan was looking for a partner. Dean was eager to get in on it. Jan and Dean were formed. And they continued to have hit singles, Heart and Soul, on and on, several hit singles. Their first album was actually called Jan and Dean's Golden Hits. Now, you don't see a lot of acts starting with Golden Hits as their first album release, but again, they were pretty much a singles act, so this was a collection of their singles. Now, their singles at this time tended to be either sort of covers of current hits or older showbiz, more standard tunes, all done doo-wop style. And they also have a sense of humor to their music that is an acquired taste. You've heard me talk kind of criticizingly of the Beach Boys' sense of humor on things like Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson, or some of the stuff on Smiley Smile. Well, compared to Jan and Dean, the Beach Boys are the Algonquin Round Table or George Bernard Shaw. Jan and Dean's sense of humor seemed to come from overpronouncing their words so that they sounded either moronic or like nerds or maybe just sarcastic or ironic or something. It's a very lowest common denominator kind of humor and really an acquired taste. And that's present from the very, very beginning of Jan and Dean. Fortunately, it kind of dissipates a little bit. The later recordings are actually a little bit easier to take as they tone down the goofy voices. So as Jan and Dean are already pretty well established in showbiz, the Beach Boys come out with their first record, Surfin'. And everybody kind of recognizes the influence there. There's the bop a bop dip dip dips are sort of a Jan and Dean thing that the Beach Boys have adopted for surfing. Jan and Dean recognize it themselves. But when the bands meet later on, when they're doing the same circuit, they become friendly. And the Beach Boys first work with Jan and Dean for 2 tracks on their second album, Jan and Dean Take Linda Surfin', this is where Jan and Dean cross over into surfing territory. They recorded both Surfin' and Surfin' Safari, which had already been hits for the Beach Boys, on this album. Now the interesting thing about these cover versions is the instrumental backing and the backing vocals are both provided by the Beach Boys themselves. So this is really the Beach Boys re-recording Surfin' and Surfin' Safari with Jan and Dean singing lead. So that makes it kind of cool. Incidentally, the Linda in the Jan and Dean Take Linda Surfin' title is an earlier hit single based on a 1946 composition by Jack Lawrence called Linda. Jack Lawrence was a writer. He did If I Didn't Care, which was the first hit for the Ink Spots in the 40s. He also did All or Nothing at All, which was Frank Sinatra's big first solo hit, and wrote the song Linda. Linda was named for his lawyer's 1-year-old daughter. And that Linda, being the daughter of his lawyer Lee Eastman, a couple of decades later began to have very, very many more songs written about her when she became Mrs. Paul McCartney. So this is the Linda of the 1946 song Linda by Jack Lawrence. Jan was already an established writer, producer, and arranger, and I'm sure that had some impact on Brian Wilson's trajectory as well. They were put together in late 1962, early 1963 to try to do some writing together. And Brian famously showed Jan his new song Surfin' USA, which Jan was very interested in covering, but Brian had already reserved that for the Beach Boys. In fact, they'd already started recording it. He had a partially finished song that Jan helped him finish, and it became a #1 hit and was featured on Jan and Dean Surf City and Other Swingin' Cities album, their third Jan and Dean album. Now, Murray Wilson was reputedly, and probably understandably, a little ticked off that Brian had basically given a hit to Jan and Dean, although it sounds as if the song was not really complete and that Jan did write some major sections of it. But this was a big, big hit and a big success for Brian as a writer with Jan and Dean. Brian Wilson also gets co-composer credit on the B-side to Surf City, a song called She's My Summer Girl. Now, composed also around this time was a song known as Gonna Hustle You, which Jan and Brian co-wrote, but it was not released at the time because the lyrics were a little too racy. It came out sometime later. Gonna Hustle You appears on this 1996 compilation as well as elsewhere, but on this compilation, all the hits from Surf City to Drag City, you get a version called Get a Chance With You that clearly has Brian Wilson speaking at the beginning and has Brian Wilson's vocal. So it's kind of cool. This is more of a Brian Wilson version of the song that's available here. It may be available elsewhere, but that's where I found it. Jan and Brian followed up their success with Surf City with a hot rod equivalent, Drag City, which went to number 10. And this also credits Roger Christian, Brian's oft-time collaborator, along with Jan and Brian as a writer. And Roger Christian will be credited on many of the future Barry Wilson compositions, including Dead Man's Curve, which makes its debut appearance here. It's not the hit single version, it is an earlier version. This version apparently featuring Brian Wilson on backing vocals. He's not on the hit single version, but he is on the first version, which appears on the album Drag City. This album also includes a cover of the Beach Boys' Little Deuce Coupe. Now, according to some sources, including the usually impeccable Surf's Up book, like the earlier Surfin' and Surfin' Safari covers, this book says that that version of Little Deuce Coupe has the Beach Boys on backing vocals and instrumentation. Now, there's a terrific Jan and Dean volume. This is a phenomenally good book by Jan and Dean, the Jan and Dean record by Mark A. Moore. It is just chock full of information. It's just a phenomenal source and phenomenal amount of information on Jan and Dean there. According to this, the Beach Boys do not appear on that cover version of Little Deuce Coupe. I will defer to Mark A. Moore on anything concerning Jan and Dean if he can put together a volume like that. So I think the thing about them appearing on that version is incorrect. So the song Dead Man's Curve appears on the Drag City album and is re-recorded early in 1964 as a single and becomes a hit, goes to number 8 on the chart. Now this single again is a co-write between Jan, Roger Christian, and Brian Wilson. And apparently Roger Christian had envisioned the song ending with a tie in the drag race rather than the car crash. Jan Berry pushed for the car crash ending to the song, which it features. I've always been interested to figure out exactly where Dead Man's Curve is in Los Angeles. Now, according to the lyrics, they come off the line at Sunset and Vine. They're racing westbound down Sunset. And the lyrics say they passed Doheny, Schwab's, and Crescent Heights, and all the Jag could see were my 6 taillights. La Brea and Crescent Heights being north-south streets that intersect Sunset, and Schwab's being the famous drugstore that's no longer there. That's all very straight. Then he says, he passed me at Doheny and I started to swerve. I pulled her out and there I was at Dead Man's Curve. Well, I lived on Doheny in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I could never figure out, there's no big curve there. I mean, at the end of the Sunset Strip, the road curves south a little bit, but it certainly is no Dead Man's Curve. Well, apparently Dead Man's Curve is way further out near the gate to Bel Air and UCLA, where the road does get a lot curvier on the other side of Beverly Hills. In fact, in the mid-'80s, when I first moved to Los Angeles, I actually spun out there myself when I had not yet learned that you can't drive in rain in Los Angeles the same way you can in the Midwest. I did nearly a 180. Miraculously, I didn't hit anybody. Nobody hit me, and I was able to just straighten out and keep going. But I've actually wiped out at this turn near Bel Air that is apparently the Dead Man's Curve referred to in the song. What I found confusing is that most of the lyrics take place between Vine Street and Doheny, which is like 4.5 miles. And then in one line, he starts to swerve and recovers, and suddenly he's out by the Bel Air gate, which is an additional over 5 miles away. So this race is like nearly 10 miles long, with the second half of it all being condensed down into sort of 1.5 lines of lyric or something. But anyway, that's apparently where Dead Man's Curve is out there by UCLA, where it curves around by the gate to Bel Air and Bellagio, where Brian Wilson famously lived for so many years. So like the Stingray and the XKE, we'll end this episode of the Beach Boys Basement at Dead Man's Curve. There are other Brian Wilson and Jan Berry co-writes to talk about, lots of other times that the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean have crossed paths over the years. We'll talk about those in future episodes. Hope you enjoyed this. Thanks. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Bye.